My name is Sebastian, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about temporality and development. So towards the beginning of my tenure as an educator in the Marshall Islands, walking back and forth between the school and the garden where I worked, I began to notice the same small group of like 2 to 3 men sitting outside of different homes on the island. Initially, I was kind of confused, and I kind of construed it as sort of loitering or wasting time, whereas in reality, it was actually a traditional act of making time in the social and ecological landscape of the community. These men were, in fact, the leaders of the fishermen on the island, and as such, they held the traditional knowledge of the reef, not only in terms of knowing where to find the fish, but also as to how to prevent over-harvesting the fish, which was a feature that they constantly needed to stave off. So the extended squatting that they're doing in front of people's houses was actually a signal to the other fishermen as to where they should be fishing on that day. My misreading of this practice, as well as seeing these bands of fishermen as potentially threatening rather than actively managing the biodiversity on the reef, really threw into distinction the different perspectives that we had about the future of the reef, as well as the disconnect between the social and environmental relations that I, as a development worker, and the community were attempting to mediate in very different ways. These kinds of cultural misunderstandings and misalignments of aims are relatively common in the development field, but I'd like to point to a deeper issue, one that involves time and the way that development involves negotiating different meanings of temporality. My capstone project began as a desire to critically examine the conceptual basis of our practice. I wanted to deconstruct some of the thinking that determines the theories upon which we act. Time as a development concept is pervasive and seemingly self-evident, so I landed upon that and started with a deceptively simple question: what is development time? So I conducted an instrumental case study using 18 of our own self-selected graduate students here in the MDP cohort, and I coded and analyzed 35 essays describing what development means, the meaning of development. And the assignment was one that we had to complete during our first semester and then revisit 1 year later. What I found was that from the first essay to the second, there was a noticeable shift in emphasis as to what development is, from ideas about social consciousness and movement, as well as personal feelings and emotions, hopes, desires, doubts, to more instrumental categories like science and technology, particularly economics, and their applications. The future as a temporal aspect was used a little more than 40% of the time in the clauses that I coded as compared to the past or the present. What my analysis shows, perhaps unsurprisingly, is that the discourse of development time centers around future transformations using the practices and knowledge derived from an interwoven tapestry of disciplines. However, this future is often one that was construed as singular and predictable rather than possible and contingent. So as development practitioners, we might do more to consider temporal dynamics and relativity, not only in terms of how interventions unfold, but also as a potential site of tension and obscurity when we use terms such as sustainability, and also as a kind of epistemic authority when we talk about who gets to authenticate a future as a desirable one, how different development tools might predicate exclusion and a mutual othering, especially in the context of complex colonial and post-colonial histories. Thereafter, I set about triangulating my findings by conducting a series of semi-structured interviews with using people from the same original sample. And I reread the essays, pulled in some relevant philosophical literature, and a new, well, kind of new, but a complementary conception of development time began to emerge, and from which I developed a hypothesis that I would like to share with you guys about how, as development practitioners, we are temporal, and development time as such is our being meaningfully present. We embody development time in the way that we structure significance. Time is the way things can be meaningfully present as a result of convention-dictated frameworks of understanding, as well as a commitment to particular possibilities. So, for example, the present activity of handing out bed nets occurs within a realm of intelligibility that includes mosquitoes, sleeping, the tropics, as a result of an inherited tradition of understanding from things like medical science, public policy, an ethos of wanting to help people, and the projection onto a future goal about, in this instance, reducing childhood morbidity. So, in conclusion, by asking the question of development time, we're actually asking a question about meaning, one that involves the self, others, and the world. By continuing to explore time and other fundamental concepts of development, I believe we can reflect more intelligently on our aims, as well as open possibilities for wisdom in our practice. Thank you.
Questions, reflections? This is about you.
Yes, sir.
I have a lot to say. How would you change development practice of the way that we teach courses like this, given that you have this realization, basically, of new relativity theory for development?
Mm-hmm. That's a really good question. I think that too often the classes that we take have a tendency to gloss over certain terms. We spoke about it briefly, this idea of buzzwords, and how to use an idea that a very famous philosopher came up with. It's this idea that these concepts, when they're taken outside of the constraints of the rules that we use in development, they stop making sense. And that sort of disjuncture is one that is really detrimental to what it is that we're trying to do. So really, attempting, just allowing the space to discuss what it is that we mean, and where that meaning is coming from as well. Because it has an existential ground, which is what I was trying to point to.
I'm trying to understand, but in this slide, how would you define significance if you have to?
Yeah, exactly. So that, I mean, the idea being that we always arrive somewhere in such a way that things are meaningful. It's impossible for me, even right now, to be up here in front of this class without understanding myself as full of meaning as a student, understanding what it is that I need to do here. And a lot of that is about this like coincidental temporal like ecstasy in terms of, well, that's a philosophical term in terms of like stepping outside of yourself. And I'm projecting onto the future possibility of not having to stand up here as like getting my degree. There's like, I'm doing this for a reason. So the future is present, and I'm also inheriting this tradition of what it means to be a student. And in that way, the room, the desks, you people all make sense to me. That makes sense?
I don't know if you ever read Bhagavad Gita. Time has a huge significance in that, and I'm not going to dwell into that. But what I think is important here, and I'm trying to understand what you're trying to get to.
Sure.
When we look at change or trying to make change, we're looking at time. Like there is something that is now, and how soon can we get to something that we desire, right? And is that what you mean by development time, in the sense that you come with a certain aspect of, I am here and this is my goal, while as there is somebody else who is there and they have different goals. And that's where the aspect of time clashes, where your time is different than their time, in terms of the realm of change. You're trying to influence somebody's livelihood versus they're living their livelihood. So I didn't quite understand what you mean by development time in that sense. Is it purely subjective of the person who, us, or are you talking as in the community in terms of, their level of change or time is different? So as example of your fishermen, their way of doing things is completely based on their sense of time, right? When it should be done or how it should be done is completely up to them. Versus when you're coming in and trying to say that, we need to move things around, or I have a certain agenda. So what is your development time? Is it just purely about us thinking about our relevance, or is it also about the community?
It's about this idea of significance. So like I was saying to Professor Zilberman before, the idea is that the time of that community, or however it is that they're construing it, is not mappable onto the concept of time that we have. But what is similar and runs in parallel is that way that we make significance, that we embody significance. So the fishermen inherited this knowledge of the reef, and they understood that, and they were presently acting in such a way so that they could protect preserve the health of the reef. And that coincidental aspect of time, this past, future, present, is it's the same. It's complementary to the way that we as development practitioners arrive with a set of theories, are presently acting in order to achieve something in the future. That's the idea. I mean, again, I feel like this is kind of a loss, so I'd love to talk to you guys more. But yeah. Sweet.
All right, so.
Can I ask a question?
Yep.
How do you consider learning in the way that you structure time and significance? So like if you're kind of going in, like you were going into the martial islands trying to do that work that you were doing, and you came in with a certain set of knowledge and you left with more knowledge, broader perspective. So was the significance of what you did, like coming into it, was there like some sort of tangible way that you describe your significance? And did that change as you came out of it, kind of a broader perspective? Like, if you could just talk a bit.
I think so again, I think this idea of learning and the way that learning as an idea of like accruing a knowledge base is one that is particular to a set of individuals. It's a publicly, communally understood concept, and that might differ from depending on where it is that who it is that you're looking at. Particularly in that instance, I don't don't really remember having any kind of epiphany. This is very much in hindsight. Yeah. I think there's this whole other aspect of what it is that I want to talk about that sees what it is that we do as like. Aristotle talks about the doxa, which is the polis, the way that the polis understands itself. But there's like an authentic way of viewing ourselves outside of this like thinking thing, the res cogitans, that I think is really is more primordial, and it's like way far out there, so I don't want to talk about it. Yeah. I probably half answered your question.
Okay.